No one knew her name when she walked through the tall glass doors of United Federal Bank that morning. No one cared. She was too quiet, too slow, too worn for a place like that. In a lobby gleaming with ambition and drenched in polished marble, she was invisible, or at least she was supposed to be. Chicago's financial district was alive with power suits, espresso runs, and deals inked over lunch. United Federal sat like a throne at the corner of Wabash and Monroe, its logo embossed in gold, its reputation airtight. The kind of place where money didn't just talk, it decided who got to speak. Then she entered. A woman, likely in her 80s. Petite, fragile even, dressed in a weather-beaten coat that hung low like a burden she'd carried far too long. Her skirt brushed the tops of scuffed leather shoes, the kind no one sold anymore. Over one shoulder hung a canvas bag, faded olive green, fraying at the corners. It looked as though it had stories to tell, if anyone bothered to listen. They didn't. The security guard glanced at her with mild annoyance. A teller behind the counter gave her that tight-lipped smile reserved for people who obviously didn't belong. A man in line made a point of stepping further away, tugging his briefcase closer. She said nothing as she walked to the center of the lobby. Her steps were slow but deliberate, as though she knew exactly where she was going and didn't care how long it took to get there. Conversations dipped, eyes shifted. She stopped in the middle of the room, raised her chin slightly, and then she spoke. "This bank belongs to me." 5 words. 5 quiet, measured words that detonated through the marble and glass like a brick through a stained glass window. At first, no one moved. Then came the laughter. Quick and sharp, like the kind that follows a bad joke no one's brave enough to correct. A woman in a red blazer smirked and shook her head. 2 tellers exchanged glances, one mouthing, "What the hell?" behind a cupped hand. A customer chuckled audibly, pulling out his phone. The security guard, Derek, his name tag read, began walking toward her with a purposeful gait. "Ma'am," he said, stretching the word into a warning. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You can't be causing a disturbance." She turned her head toward him slowly. Her eyes, dark, sharp, impossibly steady, locked with his. There was no fear in them, no defiance either. Just a kind of certainty that made Derek hesitate, just slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I'm here to be remembered." And with that, she bent down and set the canvas bag at her feet. The laughter faltered. The smirk softened into confusion. She opened the bag. Her hands were old but careful, like those of a pianist preparing to play a final forgotten piece. From inside, she drew out an envelope thick with documents. A faded black and white photograph. A small, leather-bound ledger. "I am Loretta Mae Johnson," she said, lifting the photo high enough for the crowd to see. "In 1951, I stood beside my husband, Jeremiah Johnson, and we opened the doors to what would later become this very bank." Murmurs rippled through the room like an electrical current. A man near the window squinted at the photo. A younger woman stepped forward slightly, trying to get a better look. "We poured our savings into a dream," Loretta continued. "We built a place that served the community. Black families, immigrant families, people no one else would lend to. We built this from nothing." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping and read aloud the headline. "First Black-owned community bank opens on Chicago's South Side." "But when Jeremiah died," she said, her voice lowering, "they came for it. They came for me." She laid the newspaper beside the ledger. "They told me I didn't belong in finance, that a widow, and a black one at that, couldn't manage a business. They told me to grieve quietly and leave the numbers to the men." Her voice didn't tremble, but the room did. "I was erased," she said. "My name, my rights, my investment, all stolen, and for 70 years, I carried the truth. In silence, in shame, until today." Derek stepped back, visibly shaken now. Phones were no longer raised for mockery, but to record history. "I'm not here for your charity," Loretta said. "I'm here to reclaim what I built, what was taken." Behind her, Marcus Heller, the regional bank director, had appeared on the mezzanine. His expression, cool, managerial, flickered with discomfort. "Someone get her out of here," he muttered. But no one moved. Because something about her was unshakable. The way she stood, the way her voice wrapped around the walls, the way the light hit her weathered face as she held up that old photograph. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't the madness of an old woman with a failing memory. It was truth. Uninvited. Undeniable. The kind of truth that made people shift in their $2,000 suits. The kind that made decades of silence feel suddenly loud. Loretta looked out at the lobby, her voice calm but devastating. "You built fortunes on my silence," she said. "Today, I'm speaking." And for the first time in that immaculate lobby, no one interrupted her. Not because they agreed with her, but because they felt it. Something real. Something old. Something that would not be ignored this time. Silence hovered thick in the bank lobby, the kind that felt heavier than noise. For a moment, it was as if time held its breath. All eyes were on the frail, determined woman in the center of the room, standing not with pride, but with the weight of unspoken decades balanced in her spine. Loretta Mae Johnson reached once more into her canvas bag. The old fabric whispered as her hand moved. Slowly, with reverence, she pulled out the first document. A deed. A notarized property record from 1951, with her name, her husband's, and the original address of the Johnson Community Bank. She unfolded it like a sacred scroll. The paper had yellowed, its edges curled like it had fought against time and lost. But the ink remained bold, the signatures intact. She held it out, not for show, but as proof. No spectacle. Just truth. "This is where it began," Loretta said, her voice steady. "The land deed. The first piece of ground we bought with our own money." A hush rippled through the crowd. People leaned in closer, straining to see. She then retrieved a weathered journal, leather-bound, held together by a single leather strap that had darkened over the years. With slow fingers, she untied it. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes, customer names, loan logs, deposits, dreams. "I wrote in this every night," she whispered. "After the doors closed, after I swept the floors and counted every dollar in the drawer. These pages hold the names of the first 100 people we ever served. People who had been turned away elsewhere because of the color of their skin. People who brought their hope to our counters because they had nowhere else to go." Her voice caught slightly, just enough to stir the air. "It wasn't just a bank," she said. "It was a refuge." She paused and let that word settle. Refuge. More papers followed. Photographs. One showed Loretta and Jeremiah standing proudly in front of the original brick building. Modest, but built by hand. Jeremiah's arm wrapped around her shoulder, both of them young, with fire in their eyes. Another photo captured a line of families on the grand opening day, dressed in their Sunday best, holding hands and smiling at something more than just a camera. One of the tellers, a young black woman named Camille, brought her hand to her mouth. She recognized the faces in the photo. Her grandfather was in that crowd. Loretta continued her quiet unveiling. A letter, typed, dated 2 months after her husband's funeral. Addressed to her, from the newly formed transition committee that had, at the time, offered their deep condolences before laying out a list of restructuring recommendations. Among them, the sale of all Johnson assets to a holding company, the dissolution of community voting rights, and, without explanation, the removal of Loretta's name from any founding records. "They told me it was for my own protection," she said. "That banking was no place for a grieving widow. They said I was lucky they were willing to help me at all." Her fingers gripped the letter tighter, but her voice remained level. "I didn't understand at the time how quickly your name can disappear. I had built it all with Jeremiah, and within weeks it was as if I never existed." Another document followed. A meeting memo from 1952, stamped confidential. It outlined plans for the acquisition of Johnson Community Bank by Mid-State Holdings, which decades later would merge into United Federal Bank. It referenced the opportunity created by the founder's death, and described Loretta as emotionally unstable and financially inexperienced. The cruelty of it felt sharpened by time. "I was neither," she said softly. "I was just inconvenient." The lobby was dead silent now. No more laughter. No more whispers. Just the weight of a truth too long buried, rising like floodwater. Upstairs, Marcus Heller watched through the glass, his knuckles pale against the railing. He had never heard of Loretta Mae Johnson. Not once. He had studied the bank's legacy, read every commemorative brochure, attended centennial ceremonies. And yet, she had never been mentioned. Not even once. Downstairs, Loretta's hands moved slower now, the toll of memory pressing into her bones. She pulled one final item from the bag, a ledger sheet. Thin, brittle, yet entirely intact. "This," she said, holding it up with both hands, "is my name, my investment. $30,000, pulled from our life savings, our wedding gifts, and what we could borrow from family. Every penny accounted for. It was all there. Date of deposit, purpose, initial capital for incorporation, signatories, Jeremiah and Loretta Johnson. And then a final line, handwritten by Loretta herself. We build not just for profit, but for people." She looked up. "I kept this because I knew one day someone would ask to see it. They never did." She didn't cry. Not yet. But her voice took on the texture of grief, softened only by time. "You all walk these floors thinking this bank was born from prestige and power. But its foundation was struggle, sacrifice, community. And it came from the hands of people you were taught to forget." That was when Camille, the teller, stepped forward. She reached for one of the photos and examined it closely. "My grandfather," she whispered. This is him." Loretta smiled, a soft, weary smile that had waited 70 years to be seen. For the first time, the history of United Federal Bank no longer belonged to its brochures or boardrooms. It belonged to her. And everyone knew, this wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. At first, no one moved. Loretta Mae Johnson stood surrounded by scattered documents, proof of her history, her investment, her erasure. And yet, a strange paralysis held the room. A space once ruled by order and polite transactions now hung between disbelief and revelation. No one had ever seen something like this. An elderly black woman stepping into the heart of corporate America with nothing but a canvas bag, a lifetime of silence, and the kind of truth that couldn't be ignored. Then a voice cut through the stillness. "I remember her." The words came from near the rear of the crowd, from a man who had entered earlier unnoticed. He stepped forward slowly, cane in one hand, a brown fedora in the other. His presence commanded quiet. He was old but upright. His gray suit was impeccably pressed. And his voice, steady, certain. "My father worked city records," he said. "Back in the 50s. I was a boy, maybe 10. I stood on the sidewalk when they cut the ribbon on Johnson Community Bank. I remember her face." All eyes turned toward him. "I remember because it was the first time I ever saw a black woman speak into a microphone in public. She didn't stutter. She didn't blink. She just spoke." Loretta turned toward the man, and for a moment, her composure cracked, just slightly. "Your name, sir?" someone asked. "Kenneth Rhodes," he said. "And I will swear that in court." Something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even visible to most. But in the current of the room, you could feel it. The tide turning. Angela Tran, the bank's assistant legal officer, who had watched all of this from behind the reception desk, now stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tightness in her jaw that hadn't been there earlier. She spoke calmly, but firmly. "Everyone, I'm invoking Internal Procedural Code 7.17. This situation is no longer a customer service issue. It's now a legal matter." A ripple of surprise passed through the employees. Angela reached for the documents on the counter, gently arranging them into order. The deed, the journal, the financial ledger, the letter, the photos. Then, She addressed Loretta directly. "Ms. Johnson," she said, with a quiet kind of respect. "May I sit with you in one of our meeting rooms while we review these? I want to ensure everything you've brought is properly handled and cataloged." Loretta gave a small nod. "You may." But Loretta didn't move yet. Instead, she turned to face the room one last time. "I'm not just here to take something back," she said. "I'm here because truth only dies when we bury it in shame. I was ashamed once. Ashamed I'd let them erase me. Ashamed I hadn't fought harder." She looked around at the faces in the room. But shame doesn't belong to the truth. It belongs to the liars. Someone in the crowd, a woman in her 40s, wearing a navy blue blouse, began clapping. It was hesitant, unsure. But it caught. Then another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the bank lobby was filled with the sound of rising applause, not thunderous, not forced, but real. And under it all was something even more powerful. A silence no one wanted to break, as if everyone knew they were standing inside a moment that would soon be history. Upstairs, Marcus Heller stood frozen. He'd been watching everything unfold from behind the glass panels of the mezzanine. His world, so controlled, so organized, was unraveling. And yet, some part of him, a part long buried under policy memos and spreadsheets, recognized that what was happening wasn't chaos. It was clarity. He turned to one of his assistants. "Get legal on the phone. Right now." Back downstairs, Angela gently led Loretta into one of the consultation rooms, now filled with fresh eyes and more questions than anyone had answers for. People began texting. One man live-streamed the moment. Within 10 minutes, hashtags began to appear online. Number Loretta Mae Johnson, number Banking on Justice, number Forgotten Founder. By noon, the video had hit 20,000 shares. By 1 o'clock, a national news outlet called for verification. And by 2, the Chicago Tribune had assigned a reporter to the building, already asking staff what they knew about a woman who had never appeared in the official records. Angela, sitting beside Loretta in the room, took a deep breath. This is going to escalate quickly. Loretta looked down at the old ledger in her lap, then back at the young woman beside her. "That's how the lie spread," she said. "Fast. No one questioned it. No one paused. Maybe it's time the truth moved just as fast." Angela nodded. "It already is." Outside, a group of young bank employees, Camille among them, were searching online databases, trying to find any mention of Loretta Mae Johnson in the bank's Centennial Archive. There was nothing, not even a footnote, not a single line. But now, thanks to a worn canvas bag and a voice that refused to die in silence, the erasure was being undone. And for the first time in 70 years, someone was listening. By the time the legal team arrived, the bank no longer felt like a bank. The sleek modern lobby of United Federal had transformed into something else. Part courtroom, part confessional, part stage. What had begun as a spectacle of ridicule had become a scene of reckoning. The walls that once echoed with quiet conversations and transaction approvals now seemed to breathe with unspoken histories, stories that had waited decades to surface. Loretta Mae Johnson sat quietly at the consultation table as folders were opened and pages examined. Around her, the air was taut with the tension of professionals attempting to maintain order while the foundation of their institution quivered beneath them. Angela Tran, seated beside her, led the internal review, scanning each document with meticulous care. They started with the deed. The original was authenticated by 2 legal officers within minutes. Clear signatures, notarized with a visible date. No forgery, no ambiguity. Next came the ledger. "What we're holding here," Angela said to the room, "is not just a financial record. It is a historical ledger, handwritten in a style no one uses anymore, organized with meticulous detail. It matches city records of loan activity from the 1950s. Every entry lines up." One of the attorneys, assigned by the corporate office after the video went viral, frowned and turned to Marcus Heller, the regional director. "You're telling me no one here knew any of this?" Marcus's silence was not just damning, it was revealing. He'd spent years building a career on compliance, on image, on upward mobility. But now, standing in the center of a truth too old to hide and too fresh to dismiss, all he could offer was stillness. I knew the name Johnson, he admitted finally, but I always assumed it referred to Jeremiah. I had no idea Loretta existed. She's never appeared in any official briefings. Not a word. Because they made sure I didn't, Loretta said. Her voice was soft, but every ear turned toward it. You don't just disappear from records, you're erased, and when no one goes looking, the silence becomes your legacy. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably. A junior legal associate whispered, "This is going to get complicated." But complicated wasn't the word. It was bigger than that. What sat before them was proof that the very origin of their institution was built on a theft, a sanitized story constructed to align with power, whiteness, and control. Angela continued the presentation. There's more. These typed memos were internal. They reference a vote held in 1952 among the surviving board members to strip Mrs. Johnson of any authority following her husband's death. The justification? She paused, reading the line aloud. Lack of emotional and financial capacity due to gender and race. Gasps broke out across the room. One of the younger board members stood up abruptly. "We can't have this linked to us publicly," he said. "This is over 70 years old. Surely there's some statute, some limit." Angela cut him off. "There is no statute of morality, and there are no limits when it comes to correcting history." Outside, news outlets had begun to gather. A crowd was forming around the entrance. Someone had spray-painted "Loretta was here" in chalk along the sidewalk. The story had leapt from social media to local TV, and now the national networks were circling. One of the older executives leaned toward Marcus. "You need to control this before it ruins the bank." But Marcus didn't answer right away. Something had changed in his face. He looked at Loretta, really looked at her. Not as a threat or a nuisance, but as a woman who had built the very floor he stood on, and then been cast into shadow so the institution could flourish without her. He cleared his throat. "What if we didn't control it?" he said. "What if we faced it?" Silence fell. Eyes turned toward him, confused, stunned. "Marcus," one of the lawyers warned, "you don't understand what you're suggesting. If we validate her claims, we open ourselves to restitution, lawsuits, financial damage beyond repair." "But if we don't," Marcus said, "we're validating the lie." Loretta watched him quietly. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She had heard every kind of excuse, every form of manipulation. But in Marcus's voice, for the first time, she sensed something genuine. A flicker of internal reckoning, the kind that only happens when a man sees his whole world exposed and still chooses to walk toward the truth instead of away from it. He continued, more resolute now. "She has the documents. She has the history. And we have the responsibility." Angela looked at him surprised. "What are you proposing?" "Immediate board review, full investigation, a public statement acknowledging Loretta's foundational role, and reparations, whatever form they take. If this bank is ever going to be more than a facade, it needs to start by owning the bricks it was built with." Another lawyer snapped, "You'll lose your position. The Matthews family won't stand for this." Marcus turned toward the glass wall where the city stretched beyond them. Somewhere out there, someone was watching this unfold, waiting to see whether the truth mattered more than profit. "I'm not protecting a legacy built on lies," he said. "Not anymore." Angela looked at Loretta, who simply nodded, then whispered, "It's happening." But even in that moment of victory, Loretta's face did not show triumph. It showed exhaustion, a kind of spiritual fatigue only survivors know. The fight for truth had never been about reclaiming wealth or status. It had always been about restoring her name to the world before it was too late. She looked at the bank's gold emblem on the wall, the one that used to make her stomach turn. Now it looked different, still hollow, but not untouchable. And for the first time in 70 years, someone was finally reaching for it with clean hands. 1 week later, the name Loretta Mae Johnson was no longer whispered in the shadows. It was printed in headlines. It was trending on social media. It was spoken aloud in city halls, community centers, and college classrooms. But most importantly, it was finally engraved in the place that had once tried to erase her, the granite plaque outside United Federal Bank. On a crisp Thursday morning, the sun cast soft gold across the newly unveiled dedication. The Loretta Mae Johnson Building. Co-founder, 1951. The crowd had gathered early. Press, community leaders, students, and elders who remembered the days when the South Side had only one bank that welcomed black families. Many of them had tears in their eyes. At the center of it all stood Loretta. Dressed in navy, the same color she had worn 70 years before on the bank's opening day, she looked out over the crowd with an expression that blended peace, gravity, and something more elusive: release. When she approached the microphone, the applause came like a rising tide. But she didn't raise her hands to quiet it. She waited. She let the sound wash over her because this time, she wanted to hear it. She deserved to hear it. And then, when the final claps faded, she began. "I was 26 when we opened our first bank doors," she said. "Back then, I thought the hardest part would be surviving the numbers. The loans, the defaults, the regulators. But I was wrong. The hardest part was surviving the silence." She paused, and the audience leaned in closer. "When Jeremiah passed, they told me I was no longer needed. They said a woman's role was to mourn and step aside, that I should be grateful the bank would continue without me. But what they really meant was that I had outlived my usefulness, and that a black woman had no place at the table once the chairs got comfortable." Her voice didn't shake. It carried across the plaza like truth long buried in concrete now breaking through the cracks. "They took my name off the records, but they couldn't take it out of the walls. I felt it every time I walked past this place. I watched my own creation grow without me, flourish on the back of my silence." She glanced toward the group of young employees standing to the side. Angela Tran stood among them, alongside Camille and several others who had helped bring her truth forward. "I don't blame the young ones. I blame the old system. But now that we've torn a hole in it, you all get to decide what grows in its place." The applause returned, but it was different this time. Quieter, more reverent, like a room exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Later that day, inside the newly renamed building, Marcus Heller hosted a press briefing. With cameras rolling and reporters recording every word, he confirmed that the bank would officially recognize Loretta Mae Johnson as co-founder and would launch a multi-million-dollar fund in her name, the Johnson Legacy Fund, dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs of color, especially women, in accessing the capital they had too long been denied. Marcus was no longer the clean-cut executive reciting a company line. His suit remained sharp, but there was something raw in his tone now, a humility forged by exposure. "I don't just want to acknowledge the past," he said. "I want to be part of fixing it. And if that costs me position or power, so be it. Because what good is leadership if it hides behind lies?" The announcement sent ripples through the business world. Other banks faced questions about their histories. Archived names were pulled. Old founders' photos were scrutinized. Loretta's story had done more than reclaim a name. It had sparked a movement. Back in her apartment that evening, Loretta sat by the window with a cup of tea, her fingers curled gently around the warmth. Angela dropped by, as she had every day that week, bringing updates and small gifts from people whose lives had been touched by the story. "You've got 3,000 letters," Angela said, smiling. "A college in Atlanta wants to name a lecture series after you. And a school in Bronzeville just renamed their business program in your honor." Loretta chuckled softly. Took them long enough. Angela handed her a sealed envelope. It was from a former board member, someone who had voted to erase her decades ago. The letter offered an apology, but Loretta didn't open it. She set it aside. "I'm not doing this for them," she said. "I'm doing this for the girl I used to be. The one who stayed up late with ledgers and told herself, 'This matters,' and for all the other girls who will come after her." Angela sat down beside her, quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever wish it had happened sooner?" Loretta looked out at the Chicago skyline, its lights blinking like silent witnesses. "I used to," she said. "But then I realized, truth doesn't expire. Justice isn't late. It's just delayed by the fear of what it might change." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that only falls between two people who understand the weight of time. And then softly, Angela spoke. "You changed everything." Loretta smiled, not wide, but deep. "I didn't change everything," she said. "I just stopped letting them change me." And with that, she lifted her cup in a quiet, personal toast. Not to victory, not to revenge, but to visibility, to truth, and to a name that would never again be forgotten. Her name. Loretta Mae Johnson. Not a footnote, not a rumor, but the beginning. Loretta Mae Johnson's story is not just about an old woman walking into a bank. It's a story of resilience, erasure, justice, and the undeniable power of truth. For 70 years, she carried a legacy on her back that the world refused to acknowledge. She was the co-founder of a bank, a pioneer in a time when a black woman in finance was treated not just with skepticism, but with outright hostility. After the death of her husband, she wasn't mourned by the system. She was removed from it. Her name was deleted, her contributions dismissed, and the institution she helped build was allowed to thrive without her. And yet, she never forgot. She never let that silence become final. What makes Loretta's story extraordinary is not just the injustice she faced, but the quiet, unwavering belief that the truth would one day matter again. When she returned to United Federal Bank, she didn't come with lawyers or outrage. She came with a worn canvas bag full of documents, memories, and proof. She stood in front of people who laughed at her and never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her truth did the talking. What began as mockery became revelation. A room full of strangers saw her not as a disruption, but as the original foundation they'd never known existed. And through courage, clarity, and patience, she forced a powerful institution, and an entire community, to confront what it had buried for decades. In the end, Loretta didn't just reclaim her name. She changed the narrative. She inspired a generation to question what they've been told, and to seek out the voices that history tries to silence. She became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of dignity, perseverance, and quiet revolution. The lesson we take from Loretta's journey is simple but profound. Never underestimate the endurance of truth, and never think your voice doesn't matter, especially when the world tells you to sit down and stay silent. Whether you're fighting for your name, your story, your people, or your purpose, justice isn't always swift, but it is always worth pursuing, even if it takes a lifetime. In today's world, where so many feel unheard, unseen, or dismissed, Loretta's story reminds us that the past is never fully gone. It waits for someone brave enough to bring it back into the light. And when that happens, everything can change. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, stirred your heart, or reminded you of someone who's been forgotten, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories like Loretta's. Stories that matter, stories that heal, and stories that remind us that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, always wakes up. Let's keep uncovering it together.